Relax, Margaret, my daughter-in-law Vanessa said with a laugh that carried across the dining room table. You're just the cleaner. The room filled with the polite kind of laughter people use when they're not sure whether something is a joke or an insult. I remember the sound of forks lightly touching plates, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and the way my son Daniel avoided looking directly at me. It was a Sunday evening dinner at their house in a quiet suburb outside Chicago, one of those big homes with an open kitchen and soft pendant lights hanging over the island. Vanessa had spent the last hour showing off the new marble countertops and the expensive wine she'd bought from a specialty store downtown. I sat quietly at the edge of the table, my hands wrapped around a glass of iced tea, listening as they talked about promotions, investments, and a company they were convinced was about to change their lives. The funny thing about being underestimated is that people stop watching what they say around you. They assume you don't matter enough to notice. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine like she had seen people do in movies. Daniel was telling me how lucky we are that the company doesn't even have a real owner anymore, she said. It's basically waiting for someone smart enough to take it over. Daniel chuckled, the same way he used to laugh when he was a boy trying to impress his friends. Exactly, he said. And when that deal goes through, we won't have to worry about anything ever again. I kept my eyes on the tablecloth, a soft beige fabric with tiny stitched patterns that reminded me of something my late husband once liked. 35 years of marriage teaches you many things, but one of the most important lessons is how to listen without interrupting. Vanessa glanced toward me again, that small smile still on her face. Margaret works hard though, she said in a tone that sounded almost generous. Cleaning offices all day at your age must be exhausting. The words were wrapped in sweetness, but the meaning underneath them was sharp. I nodded politely, because sometimes the simplest response is the one that reveals the most. It keeps me busy, I said quietly. Daniel shrugged. Mom likes staying active, he added, as if explaining. A harmless hobby to a room full of strangers. I watched the two of them talk about the future like they were already living in it, their voices full of confidence, their plans growing bigger with every sentence. Outside, the evening sun dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the backyard. Somewhere down the street, a lawn-mower hummed for a few seconds before going silent. Vanessa raised her glass. To new beginnings, she said. Everyone at the table lifted their drinks. I did too. Because sometimes the most interesting stories begin when people believe they already know exactly who you are. The next morning, before the city had fully woken up, I drove downtown and walked into the bank. I parked my car in the underground garage just as the morning light began slipping between the tall buildings of downtown Chicago. The city was quieter at that hour, the streets still waking up, delivery trucks rolling slowly past coffee shops that had just opened their doors. I had made this drive thousands of times over the years, always at the same calm pace, always arriving before most of the employees stepped into the building. Some habits become a part of you after enough time passes. The security guard at the front desk looked up from his small television when I walked through the lobby. His name was Carl, a retired firefighter who had worked the morning shift there for almost 8 years. He gave me the same friendly nod he always did. Good morning, Miss Collins, he said, pushing the visitor log aside even though he knew I never needed to sign it. Good morning, Carl, I replied, returning the smile. The marble floors reflected the soft glow of the ceiling lights, and the scent of fresh coffee drifted from a small break area near the elevators. By 8 o'clock the building would be full of people carrying laptops, talking about quarterly numbers and client meetings, but right now the entire place felt peaceful, almost private. I stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The quiet hum of the cables echoed faintly as the car began to rise. While the numbers above the door slowly climbed, I found myself thinking about the conversation from the night before. Vanessa swirling her wine glass. Daniel talking about opportunity like it was something waiting for him personally. People often forget how much they reveal when they believe the person listening has no influence over the outcome. The elevator doors opened onto a wide hallway lined with framed photographs showing the company's history. Some of the pictures were nearly 30 years old, showing a much smaller office and a much younger version of the two people who started it. My late husband, Thomas Collins, had always insisted that every milestone should be documented. One day, he used to say, "People will walk through these halls and remember how it all began." I walked past the photographs slowly, my footsteps quiet against the polished floor. At the end of the hallway sat a large glass door leading to the executive offices. A young receptionist looked up from her desk as soon as she saw me. Her posture straightened immediately. "Good morning, Miss Collins," she said with a warm, professional smile. "Mr. Hayes is already here and waiting for you." I nodded once and continued down the corridor toward the corner office overlooking the Chicago River. The city skyline stretched across the windows like a painting, sunlight now spreading across the tops of the buildings. Robert Hayes stood beside the conference table, reading through a stack of documents. He had been our family attorney for more than 20 years, and age had turned his hair completely silver, though his eyes still carried the same sharp attention to detail that had helped guide our company through decades of growth. He looked up when I entered the room and gave a quiet sigh that sounded more thoughtful than surprised. "Margaret," he said calmly. "I had a feeling you might come in this morning." I placed my purse gently on the table and looked out the window for a moment before turning back toward him. "Daniel and his wife believe the company does not have an active owner," I said. Robert folded his hands together and nodded slowly, as if confirming something he had already suspected. "Yes," he replied. "I have been hearing the same thing from a few people lately." I pulled out a chair and sat down at the head of the table, the same place where Thomas used to sit during board meetings. The leather felt familiar beneath my hands. Outside the window, traffic had begun to move steadily along the riverfront streets. "Then I suppose," I said quietly, "it is time to see how far they are willing to go." Robert Hayes slid a folder across the conference table toward me, the thick paper making a soft sound against the polished wood. I opened it slowly, not because I was surprised by what was inside, but because there is something about seeing plans written in legal language that makes them feel more real. Several documents were clipped neatly together, each one outlining a proposal that had been quietly circulating among investors over the past few weeks. Daniel's name appeared more than once, usually followed by careful phrases about potential leadership and strategic acquisition. Vanessa's name appeared as well, though not as frequently, usually attached to language about advisory support and partnership influence. I read each page carefully, my eyes moving steadily across the lines while Robert watched from the other side of the table. Outside the office windows the Chicago River shimmered in the morning light, and a tour boat slowly passed beneath one of the bridges, its loudspeaker echoing faintly through the glass. "They believe the original ownership structure was dissolved after Thomas passed away," Robert said quietly. "To them, the company looks like an opportunity waiting to be claimed." I placed the documents back inside the folder and rested my hands on the table. The leather chair creaked softly when I leaned back. For a moment I could almost hear Thomas's voice from years ago, explaining why he had structured the company the way he did. He used to say that patience was the most valuable asset in any negotiation. "People reveal their intentions when they think the path ahead is clear," he would tell me during late evenings in this same office. Robert adjusted his glasses and watched my expression carefully. "I assume you would like me to shut this down immediately," he said. "Legally it would not be difficult." I shook my head once. "No," I replied calmly. "Let them continue." The words seemed to surprise him for a brief moment, though he recovered quickly. Robert had known me long enough to understand that silence often meant a decision had already been made. "You want to see how far they will go," he said. "Yes," I answered. "It will be educational." Robert closed the folder and tapped it lightly against the table. "Daniel has scheduled a meeting with 2 private investors next week," he explained. "They believe they are about to secure control of the company. Vanessa has been telling people that the leadership here has been inactive for years. I nodded slowly. The description sounded very much like the confidence I had seen the night before at dinner. Ambition can make people forget to check whether the door they are opening actually belongs to them. I stood up from the chair and walked toward the large window overlooking the river. From that height the city looked calm and organized, traffic moving along the streets like steady streams of light. "Schedule a shareholder meeting," I said after a moment. "Invite everyone involved." Robert looked up from the table, curiosity now visible in his expression. "Including Daniel?" he asked. I turned back toward him with a small, quiet smile. "Especially Daniel," I replied. The room fell silent again except for the distant sound of boats moving along the river below. Robert picked up the folder once more and slipped the documents back inside with careful precision. "Very well," he said. "If that is the direction you want, I will prepare everything." I nodded once, then walked toward the door of the office. As I passed the hallway photographs again, I paused briefly in front of one picture showing Thomas standing beside the very first office we ever rented, a modest space above a small printing shop nearly 3 decades earlier. We had built everything from that room, piece by piece, decision by decision. I looked at the photograph for a second longer, then continued down the hallway toward the elevator. Because sometimes the most revealing moment in a story comes when people believe they are about to win. The drive back from downtown took a little longer that afternoon because traffic had begun to thicken along Lakeshore Drive, but I did not mind the delay. The steady movement of cars and the quiet rhythm of the road gave me time to think. Chicago in the late afternoon has a particular kind of light, the sun reflecting off the tall glass buildings and stretching long shadows across the streets. I had lived in this city most of my life, long enough to remember when the neighborhood where Daniel now lived was nothing more than rows of modest brick houses and small corner stores. By the time I pulled into my driveway, the sky had begun turning a softer shade of gold. My home was smaller than the one Daniel and Vanessa owned, but it carried something far more valuable than size. Every room held the memory of years spent building a life with Thomas. The kitchen still smelled faintly like the coffee we used to drink together every morning before leaving for work. I placed my keys on the counter and paused beside the window that overlooked the backyard. The maple tree Thomas planted 20 years ago had grown tall enough to cast shade across most of the lawn now. I remembered the afternoon he brought it home in the back of his old pickup truck, insisting that one day it would grow strong enough to outlive us both. That was the kind of man he had been. Always thinking 10 years ahead. I poured a glass of water and sat down at the small wooden table near the window. The quiet of the house felt peaceful, the kind of silence that allows memories to move freely through your mind. When Thomas and I first started the company, we did not have an office tower or conference rooms with glass walls. We had a rented space above a print shop on the south side of the city. The ceiling leaked when it rained and the heater made a loud clanking sound every winter morning. I used to arrive before sunrise with a box of invoices under one arm and a stack of coffee cups in the other. Thomas handled the contracts and the clients while I organized the finances and kept the operations running smoothly. Many nights we stayed in that office until nearly midnight, eating takeout food at a desk covered in paperwork. Daniel was only 8 years old when the business began to grow enough that we could finally hire a small staff. I still remember the way he used to sit in the corner of the office doing his homework while we finished meetings with new partners. Back then he would look around the room with wide eyes and ask questions about everything. He used to tell people at school that his parents were building something important. I leaned back in the chair and looked around my kitchen again. The years had changed many things, but the foundation Thomas and I created had remained steady. After he passed away, I made a quiet decision that very few people ever understood. I stepped away from public attention. I stopped attending most corporate events and allowed the leadership team to manage the daily operations without my presence. It made life simpler, and it allowed Daniel to build his own career without constantly living under his father's shadow. But stepping away never meant walking away. The ownership documents were still exactly where Thomas and I placed them years earlier, secured under structures that Robert had carefully designed. I finished my glass of water and stood up slowly, walking toward the small hallway where a framed photograph hung on the wall. In the picture, Thomas stood beside me in front of our first real office building, both of us smiling like two people who had just accomplished something impossible. I touched the edge of the frame lightly before turning away. Because sometimes the people closest to you forget the history that built the ground beneath their feet. I woke up early the next morning, long before the alarm clock on my nightstand had a chance to ring. The house was quiet except for the faint sound of wind moving through the branches of the maple tree outside my window. For a few moments I simply lay there, staring at the ceiling and listening to the silence that only exists before the rest of the city begins to wake up. Then I got up, made a fresh pot of coffee, and carried the mug to the kitchen table where the morning light had just begun slipping through the curtains. There is something about early mornings that clears the mind. The air feels calmer, and decisions that seemed complicated the night before often appear much simpler. I had just taken my first sip when my phone buzzed softly on the table. The name on the screen was Robert Hayes. I answered immediately. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, his voice steady as always. "I wanted to update you on the meeting arrangements." I leaned back in my chair and looked out toward the backyard. "Tell me," I replied. Robert paused briefly as if reviewing a list in his mind. "The shareholder meeting has been scheduled for Thursday morning at 10 o'clock, he explained. Several senior board members confirmed they will attend in person. I also sent formal invitations to Daniel and the investors he has been speaking with. I let a quiet breath out and nodded to myself even though he could not see it. "And their response?" I asked. Robert gave a small sound that almost resembled a chuckle. "Daniel accepted immediately," he said. He sounded very confident. He believes the meeting is about approving a leadership transition. I could picture the expression on Daniel's face when he received that invitation. The excitement. The certainty that everything was about to work in his favor. Ambition often makes people rush toward opportunities without asking who opened the door. "And Vanessa?" I asked. "She will be attending as well," Robert replied. "From what I understand, she has already been speaking with several people about the company's future direction." I placed my coffee mug down and folded my hands on the table. The kitchen clock ticked quietly on the wall behind me. "Good," I said after a moment. Robert remained silent for a few seconds before speaking again. "Margaret, I should ask one more time," he said carefully. "Do you want me to reveal the ownership structure before the meeting? It would prevent any confusion." I smiled slightly as I watched a pair of sparrows land near the base of the maple tree outside. "No," I answered calmly. "Let them walk into the room believing exactly what they believe now." Robert understood immediately. I could hear it in the way his tone shifted. "Very well," he said. "Everything will proceed as planned." After the call ended, I sat quietly for a while longer, finishing my coffee while the sun slowly climbed higher above the rooftops. The city beyond my street had already begun moving. Cars passed by every few minutes, and somewhere nearby a neighbor started a lawnmower. Life continues at its normal pace even when important moments are approaching. Later that afternoon I drove across town to the same office building where I had been working quietly for the past few years. To most of the people there I was simply a cleaning contractor who came in during the early hours to keep the offices tidy before the staff arrived. I parked in the employee lot, walked through the side entrance, and signed the same clipboard I had used hundreds of times before. The young receptionist at the front desk gave me a friendly wave as I passed. "Morning, Margaret," she said cheerfully. "Morning," I replied with the same easy smile. I pushed the cleaning cart slowly down the hallway, the wheels rolling softly across the carpet. A few office doors were already open, and I could hear employees discussing schedules and reports inside their rooms. None of them paid much attention to the woman wiping down the glass panels along the corridor. And that was exactly how I preferred it. Because sometimes the most valuable position in a building is the one where nobody thinks to look too closely. I moved the cleaning cart slowly past the row of glass offices on the 6th floor, the wheels making a soft rolling sound against the carpet while the building continued its normal rhythm around me. Most employees had already settled into their desks by that hour, and conversations drifted through half-open doors about budgets, deadlines, and client presentations. To anyone passing by, I was simply another contracted cleaner doing routine work. People tend to ignore the person holding a bottle of glass cleaner and a cloth. They rarely stop speaking when you enter the room. That morning I wiped down the long conference table near the marketing department just as two managers walked in carrying tablets and stacks of papers. They nodded politely but continued their discussion as if I were part of the furniture. The investors are excited about the leadership shift, one of them said while setting his folder down. Apparently Daniel Collins has been meeting with them privately. The other manager pulled out a chair and sat down, scrolling through something on his screen. Yes, I heard the same thing yesterday, she replied. His wife has been telling people that the company needs fresh direction. They think the ownership situation is unclear. I continued cleaning the glass panels along the wall without interrupting, moving slowly and carefully the way I always did. Years ago Thomas used to say that the quietest person in a room often hears the most valuable information. The two managers kept talking, their voices low but clear in the otherwise empty room. From what I understand, the man continued, Daniel believes the founders stepped away completely after Mr. Collins passed. He thinks the board will support him if he presents the right growth plan. The woman nodded thoughtfully. Ambitious, she said. But bold moves sometimes work if no one challenges them. I finished wiping the glass and pushed the cart gently toward the hallway, leaving the conversation behind me as if it had never happened. Down the corridor a few employees were gathered near the coffee station discussing the upcoming shareholder meeting that Robert had arranged. One of them noticed me and stepped aside politely so I could pass. Morning, Margaret, he said casually. Morning, I replied with a friendly nod while continuing down the hall. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and a group of junior analysts stepped out talking about market forecasts and expansion strategies. None of them looked twice at the woman guiding a cart filled with cleaning supplies. By late afternoon the building had become busier, phones ringing and printers humming while staff members moved between offices carrying reports. I worked quietly through each floor the way I always had, wiping down desks, straightening chairs, and collecting small trash bags from under conference tables. The routine never changed, and that consistency was part of why no one questioned my presence. When the workday finally began winding down, I returned the cart to the small maintenance room near the service elevator. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while I washed my hands in the sink and dried them with a paper towel. For a moment I stood there listening to the distant echo of conversations fading as employees prepared to leave for the evening. Then I stepped back into the hallway and walked toward the front lobby where the glass doors looked out onto the busy Chicago street. People hurried past on the sidewalk carrying briefcases and talking on their phones, unaware that the building behind them was quietly preparing for a meeting that would change several assumptions at once. As I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I glanced up at the top floors where the executive offices overlooked the river. The lights were still on in Robert's office. Everything was moving forward exactly as planned, and the most interesting part had not even begun yet. Thursday morning arrived with a calm gray sky hanging over Chicago, the kind of quiet weather that makes the city feel almost slower for a few hours. I left my house just after 7:30 and drove downtown through the steady line of morning commuters heading toward the business district. The radio played softly in the background, but I barely noticed the music. My mind was focused on the meeting Robert had arranged, the one Daniel believed would secure his future. By the time I parked in the underground garage beneath the office tower, the lobby upstairs was already filling with people carrying briefcases and paper coffee cups. I entered through the side door the same way I had for years, greeting Carl at the security desk with the same small nod. "Morning, Margaret," he said warmly. Morning, Carl, I replied as I signed the maintenance log and stepped toward the elevator. The building felt more energetic than usual that day. Groups of employees moved through the corridors discussing schedules and presentations while assistants hurried between offices with folders and tablets. The shareholder meeting had clearly drawn attention. I rode the service elevator up to the 6th floor and rolled the cleaning cart into the hallway like it was any other workday. A few staff members glanced at me and then returned to their conversations without a second thought. People rarely question what looks familiar. As I wiped down a glass panel near the central conference room, I noticed Daniel and Vanessa walking down the corridor toward the executive elevators. Daniel wore a navy suit I had never seen before, and Vanessa walked beside him with a confident smile that seemed to grow wider with every step. They were speaking quietly to two men who I recognized from Robert's notes as potential investors. Once the board understands the situation, Daniel was saying, the transition should be straightforward. Vanessa nodded enthusiastically. The company has been drifting without clear leadership for years, she added. What it needs now is direction. I continued wiping the glass slowly, my back turned slightly so they would not notice me listening. The group passed only a few feet away, their voices filled with certainty. Daniel sounded exactly the way ambitious young executives often do when they believe the future is already secured. After they turned the corner toward the executive floor, I finished cleaning the hallway and returned the cart to the maintenance room. A few minutes later I stepped into the regular elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The doors opened onto the wide hallway lined with framed photographs of the company's history, the same hallway where Thomas and I used to walk together after late board meetings years ago. Today the corridor was filled with quiet movement. As board members and senior executives arrived for the meeting. Some greeted each other with polite handshakes while assistants prepared documents on the long conference table inside the main boardroom. Robert stood near the entrance reviewing a stack of folders when he noticed me approaching. He did not say anything at first, but his expression carried the calm understanding of someone who had spent decades managing complicated situations. Everything is ready, he said quietly. I nodded once and walked past him into the conference room where large windows overlooked the Chicago River. The chairs around the table were already filling with board members and guests. Outside the door I could hear Daniel's voice approaching down the hallway, confident and steady as he greeted the investors who had followed him upstairs. The meeting was about to begin, and for the first time that morning the room grew completely silent. Daniel entered the boardroom with the confident stride of someone who believed the next hour would change his life. Vanessa walked beside him, her posture straight and composed, greeting a few of the investors with warm smiles as they took their seats along the far side of the long table. The room had grown noticeably quieter the moment they stepped inside, though Daniel seemed to interpret the silence as anticipation rather than caution. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows overlooking the Chicago River, casting soft reflections across the polished conference table where folders and printed agendas had already been placed in front of each chair. Robert Hayes stood near the head of the table reviewing a final document while several board members exchanged brief greetings with the guests who had arrived with Daniel. I remained seated near the center of the table, my hands resting calmly on the leather surface, watching the room settle into a focused stillness. Daniel noticed me after only a few seconds. His eyes moved across the room and paused with a slight flicker of surprise. For a brief moment his expression showed confusion, the same kind of reaction people have when they recognize someone in a place they did not expect to see them. Vanessa leaned closer to him and whispered something that I could not hear, though her voice carried a note of irritation. Daniel gave a small shrug as if dismissing the moment entirely. To him I was simply a familiar face from the building. Someone who worked quietly in the background and had no connection to the conversation about to take place. He turned his attention back to the investors seated beside him. "Thank you all for coming," he said confidently as he placed a folder on the table in front of him. "I believe today will be an important step toward giving this company the direction it has been missing." A few of the investors nodded politely while opening their folders. Vanessa glanced around the room with an expression that suggested she was already imagining the outcome. The board members remained calm, their expressions neutral as they waited for the meeting to formally begin. Robert stepped forward then and cleared his throat softly, a small gesture that immediately brought the room into complete silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said in his steady voice, "thank you for attending this special shareholder session." He paused for a moment and looked around the table, his gaze briefly meeting mine before continuing. "Before we review the proposals that have been submitted, there is one matter of clarification that should be addressed." Daniel leaned back slightly in his chair, looking relaxed and almost impatient to begin presenting his plans. Vanessa folded her hands neatly on the table, her confident smile still firmly in place. Around them the board members watched quietly, their attention shifting toward the head of the table where Robert stood. Robert adjusted the folder in front of him and spoke again, his voice calm and deliberate. "It has come to my attention that there has been some confusion regarding the current ownership of this company." Daniel exchanged a quick glance with Vanessa, then looked back toward Robert with a confident expression. "Yes," he replied. "That is exactly what we are here to resolve." The room remained silent as Robert slowly turned his attention toward me. Several people at the table followed his gaze, their expressions changing slightly as they waited to see what would happen next. For a few seconds no one spoke at all. Then Robert stepped aside and gestured toward my chair with quiet respect, and every person in the room understood that the conversation was about to take a very different direction. For several seconds the boardroom remained completely silent. Daniel followed Robert's gesture toward me, confusion slowly replacing the confident expression he had carried into the room only minutes earlier. Vanessa looked from Robert to me and then back again, her smile fading slightly as she tried to understand why the attorney had stepped aside. I rose from the chair slowly, smoothing the sleeve of my jacket in a calm, unhurried motion. The sunlight from the tall windows stretched across the conference table, reflecting softly off the polished wood as every person in the room watched. Robert spoke again in his measured voice. "For the sake of clarity," he said, "it is important that everyone present understands who currently holds controlling ownership of this company." Daniel leaned forward slightly, his attention now fixed entirely on Robert. "Yes," he said with a confident tone that had not yet completely disappeared. "That is exactly what we need to establish." Robert gave a small nod, then turned toward me. "The ownership structure was never dissolved," he continued. "After the passing of Thomas Collins, all controlling shares were transferred according to the legal framework established years earlier." Several members of the board exchanged brief glances, though none of them looked surprised. They had known the truth from the beginning. The only people in the room hearing it for the first time were Daniel and Vanessa. I stepped forward and placed my hands lightly on the back of the chair at the head of the table. Daniel's eyes followed the movement with growing uncertainty. Vanessa sat very still beside him, her posture stiff as the realization slowly reached her. Robert finished his explanation with the same calm authority he had shown for decades. "The majority owner of this company," he said clearly, "is Margaret Collins." The words settled across the room like a quiet weight. For a moment no one spoke at all. Daniel looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger for the first time. "Mom," he said slowly, the single word filled with disbelief. I met his gaze without raising my voice or changing my expression. "Good morning, Daniel," I replied calmly. Vanessa looked from Daniel to me, her face pale with confusion. "That is not possible," she said quickly. "She works here as a cleaner." I allowed a small, patient smile. "Yes," I answered gently. "I do." The room remained still as the meaning of that statement settled into place. Daniel leaned back in his chair, running a hand across his forehead as he tried to process the situation. Around him, the board members remained composed, waiting quietly for the moment to unfold. I moved toward the head chair and sat down, the same seat where Thomas once presided over meetings many years ago. The leather creaked softly as I settled into place. Then I looked around the table at every person present, my voice calm and steady. You believed this company did not have an owner, I said. But ownership was never the problem. Understanding the history simply required asking the right question. Daniel stared at the table in front of him, the confidence he carried into the room now completely gone. Vanessa remained silent beside him, her earlier certainty replaced with careful stillness. Robert gathered the documents from the center of the table and placed them neatly in front of me. Outside the windows the Chicago River moved slowly beneath the bridges, the city continuing its usual rhythm far below the boardroom floor. I folded my hands together and looked at Daniel once more, not with anger, but with the calm clarity that comes from experience. Now, I said quietly, let us begin the meeting.